Chapter 26 of One Commonplace Day by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Light out of darkness. She returned in a few moments with more than the book. In her hand she held an old-fashioned daguerreotype case. "Do you know who that is?" she asked, as she laid it open on the table before him. A bright boyish face looked out at him, and the gay, half-mocking smile on the mouth seemed meant for him. He gave a start of surprise, almost of dismay, as he gazed. It was impossible not to recognize in the features a strongly marked likeness to himself, so strongly marked indeed that for a moment it seemed almost as though it must have been taken for his own picture, save that the costume of the sitter was quaint and unfamiliar. "Who is it?" he asked quickly. "Where did it come from? My dear Miss Wainwright, are you a wizard, capable of spiriting a fellow back into the years which were lived before he came on the stage? This looks as though I might have been here in person 40 years ago, though I don't remember it." "You notice the resemblance, then? It is very striking. Can't you imagine whose it is? Did you never see a picture of your father when he was a young man?" "Of my father?" The light tone changed to one of astonishment, and asked, as plainly as words could have done, "What can you possibly be doing with my father's picture?" "It is a very good likeness of him as he was, not quite 40 years ago. Now you want to ask questions. Where did I get it? What right have I to keep it? There is a story connected with that picture, young man, which I did not suppose I should ever tell, but I am going to. I came honestly by the picture. He gave it to me himself when he was younger, I think, than you are now. We were friends from childhood, James and I. We studied together, and swung together, and whispered together, and as we grew older the friendship grew stronger. If you had known your father when I knew him, you would not need to have me tell you how winning and bright and noble he was, one of the most unselfish characters I have ever known. He was more to me than any friend I ever had. Yet there was something in the way of our friendship, something that grew between us. It seemed at first like such a very little thing. I had no idea it would separate us. There was, in the town where I lived, what might have been called a temperance revival, crowded meetings every evening, and throngs going up to sign the total abstinence pledge. My father was one of the most earnest workers. So was I. I was brought up to it. One evening I discovered that James had not yet put his name to the pledge book. I asked him to place it in my book. The young people were each trying to see how many signers they could get. To my astonishment, James refused to sign. We talked long together. He was not in the habit of drinking anything stronger than cider. In those days everybody drank that. He said he had no wish to drink anything stronger, and yet he would not sign the pledge. We talked about it a great deal. Evening after evening it was the subject of conversation between us. I exhausted all the arguments I could think of, and James only seemed to grow more determined. There is a great deal about it that you do not care to hear, but at last it separated us. I told him that a man who would not yield such a point as that for me could not really care for me as he thought he did. He went away from that town soon after. He parted from me in anger, and I never saw him again. There were letters and books and various keepsakes which went back to him. Only this one little picture was overlooked. I am more than 50 years old, but I never had another friend who was to me anything like what James McLean was once. Perhaps you can forgive an old woman like me for taking a very deep interest in his boy?" There was a wistful smile on her face, and almost a pleading look in the eyes that bent an earnest gaze on the young man. He looked up at last, and smiled, and tried to speak indifferently. "I thank you, I am sure, for your interest, and I thank you for your confidence. But I want to ask you if, now, after the lapse of years, you don't think you were hard on my father? Should a good, true man be thrown aside merely for the whim of another, because he differs from her and has certainly as good a right to an opinion as she? That seems to me, to say the least, a one-sided trust." The kind gray eyes watching him grew grave enough during the impetuous sentence. Miss Wainwright laid her hand on the young man's shoulder, and spoke with a quietness which contrasted sharply with his excitement. "My boy, you mistake. It was principle on the one side, and confessed indifference on the other. I believed that it was wrong for a young man to stand in the way of others, even if safe himself, and he believed in proving his power over his own will by leaving it untrammeled by pledge of any sort. Yet he did not reason in that way about other things. He was willing and anxious to take upon him marriage vows. He did not say that I did not trust him, because I expected him to pledge himself to me before the world. But there is one hard question which I must ask you. Did your father's life prove that I was mistaken or unreasonable in my demand?" The brown head of the young man dropped lower, and he had no answer to give. He had passed through humiliating scenes in his own home of which she knew nothing. It would not do to say that his father had needed no safeguards, had been equal to the temptations and snares spread for him. Lloyd McLean rose at last, and held out his hand with a smile to the woman who was watching him. "I thank you," he said again. "Perhaps you are right. At least," and now the smile faded, "at least, if a pledge would have done my father any good, I wish that he had signed one. His was a sad story." "There are other young men, remember, and your influence is helping or hindering them. Have you made up your mind which it is to be? Besides, I hold it folly in these days for any man not to use all the safeguards that he can. James McLean was the last person who would have been selected as one in special danger. Will you help us all you can?" He smiled again. "In your way, you mean, I suppose?" "Yes, in my way and your way, and every way that will not be absolutely wrong. You do not think it really would be doing wrong to sign a total abstinence pledge?" "Not wrong, perhaps, but foolish." "Well, are you not willing to be foolish, if you can help to save even such a wreck of a man as poor John Hartzell? Won't you give an old woman your promise?" "I will think of it," he answered, and then after a moment's pause, "May I have this picture, Miss Wainwright?" She hesitated, poor lonely lady. She had not shown this boy very much of her heart. She had not told him what she could have told about that early friendship, about those early hopes. How could she help hesitating? Yet here stood this son. Was not the father's picture his by right? "Yes," she said, and said it cheerfully. "It is a good, noble face. I hope it will do you good to look at it. And I hope you will trust your father's friend. I never left his name out of my prayers until God took him. Will you tell me one thing which I have wanted to know? Will you tell me how he died?" "He died on his knees, Miss Wainwright. His last words were a prayer." "Thank the Lord," said the listener, her voice trembling and her eyes dim with tears. The son went away then. He brushed the back of his hand across his eyes, he held the little old daguerreotype case tenderly. He had loved his father. The story given him to-night furnished a key to words which his father had once spoken. "A fit of obstinacy ruined me, my boy." He had wondered over it at the time, and often since. His father had not seemed to him obstinate, but on the contrary weakly yielding. This must have been the one time to which he looked back and counted his ruin. Was he weak, he wondered, like his father? Was what he called strong will merely fits of obstinacy? Miss Wainwright went with quiet step about her house, closing it for the night, an unusual pallor on her face, an empty drawer in the farthest corner of her secretary. She felt as though the one little link which had bound her to a tender past was broken now. The little old picture was gone, surrendered to one who had a better right. He had not known what it had cost her to give it. How should a heart at 20 know what a heart at 50 can feel? Nevertheless, this woman knelt, presently, with quiet face and voice, to thank God for that one who, years before, had spent his last breath in a prayer. Her heart had long since been stayed on God. The days lengthened into weeks, and passed, leaving Kate Hartzell still at her vigils. The message which Holly had sent her from his father as to the possibility of the sick man understanding something of what was going on about him had sunken into her heart. She had grasped hold of it until in her long night watches it became not only a hope, but a settled conviction on which she leaned. Part of every night she spent alone by her father's bed. Part of that time she spent in reading aloud in a slow, distinct tone verses from the Bible. Verses carefully selected, with a view to bringing light to a dark soul. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. The blood of Jesus Christ his Son cleanseth us from all sin. He is able to save to the uttermost all that come unto God by him. Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and forever. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. See that ye refuse not him that speaketh. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. These were some of the verses often repeated, which filled the darkened, quiet room night after night. Part of the time Kate knelt in prayer. Slow-spoken, simple, distinct petitions, such as a weak and weary brain might possibly follow. Lord, save my father. Forgive him now. Wash his heart in the blood of Jesus. Help him to pray. Over and over and over again did these cries ascend to God, the petitioner always buoyed up by a twofold hope. Perhaps he hears me, perhaps his heart will take up the cry, but if not, certainly God hears. So praying, so working, so waiting, I cannot say that she was surprised one night, when she was still on her knees, to hear beside her low words from the man who had been so long silent. "I hear, Kate. Go on." And Kate, trembling, scarce able to control her voice, went on. "Oh, Father in heaven, take my father, just as he is, into thy love. Forgive him, save him, because Jesus died for just such as he." "Kate," said the voice again, "that prayer about a sinner." And Kate prayed, "God be merciful to him, a sinner." On the night when she first began to pray aloud, she had cried that sentence over and over and over again into the ears of God. Her faith had not at that time taken strong hold of the hope that her father would hear, only that God would. Now it seemed that he had not only heard, but spoken to the dulled ears on the bed and bade them listen. "That is it," old Joe Hartzell said. "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." He spoke the words slowly, with long pauses between each one. Then, after a moment of silence, repeated them. "Oh, Father!" Kate said, but he only answered, "Go on, Kate." And Kate prayed. He dropped into sleep or stupor, or whatever it was, after a few minutes, and Mrs. John Hartzell, when she came to relieve the watcher, saw no change from what had been for days. But Kate, as she went to lie down on the cot which had been brought for her comfort, said to herself, "If he never speaks again, I shall have a little faint hope." And then she lay down indeed, but instead of sleeping she prayed as she had never been able to before. She felt as though God had spoken to her with an earnest of what his grace and power might do. It proved that that night was the turning point in the disease which had taken hold of Joel Hartzell's wrecked frame. He spoke several times thereafter. In fact, the very next morning, when Mrs. Hartzell came to waken Kate, her eyes showed plainly that she had been crying, but she said, "Don't you think, Kate, that father spoke to me in the night, and he knew me too." Now, Mrs. Hartzell was not in the habit of saying father. The nearest she had approached to it had been to say John's father. She had always felt a resentful feeling toward the father, as though he were the one most to blame in dragging her husband down. Therefore, the tone in which she said the word this morning told to Kate that in some way what had passed during the night had touched her heart. After that there were not many nights. The disease had spent itself, but the body was worn out and would not rally. Dr. Copeland shook his head next morning when he saw the change and the wide-open eyes. "The poor old fellow is going," he said to Mr. Cleveland, who had called to see if there were any change. They stood outside and talked it over, the plans for the coffin and the funeral. "It will be rapid work now," the doctor said. "Poor old fellow. Murder it ought to be called, but it will sound more respectable to say fever." And he sighed. Not many nights left, but Kate will never forget them. The father lay quiet and she read and prayed. Only the tone of her prayer changed, because once after she had repeated the words, "He is able to save to the uttermost all that come unto God by him," poor old Joel had said, "Kate, that is true. I wouldn't have thought that anybody could save old Joe Hartzell. He was too much for any man, but God has done it." After that Kate dropped on her knees, and her prayer began, "Father in heaven, I thank thee for thy power and thy grace and thy love." And old Joe said distinctly, "Amen." It was just as the gray light of a new morning was coming up over the town that he stirred a little in his sleep, and threw up one hand slightly, and opened his eyes and looked at Kate and said, in clear tones, "Able to save." And then the wide open eyes were set on something that Kate did not see, and the old, worn, sin-marked face grew strangely still, and Kate bending over him, bending close, saw that no breath flickered the flame of the candle which she held in her hand. "Kate," said John Hartzell, just at the door, "it is morning. I will come in and sit with father for a while, and let you rest." And Kate turned toward him and smiled. "John," she said, "it is morning with father." End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of One Commonplace Day by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Overdoing. While all these varied experiences were being lived in the Hartzell home, and in the home at Washington, and in the boarding houses of Chicago, life by no means stood still with others of our acquaintance. Fanny Copeland, for instance, was passing through an experience which seemed to her to be all rose color. The days were spent in getting rested after an evening of pleasure, and in getting ready for another of the same character. One of those spasms of activity which seem to take hold occasionally of aristocratic old towns like Eastwood, and to manage them like an epidemic, had seized upon them. Eastwood was gay; that seemed to be the fashionable name for it, and Fanny Copeland was in the fashion. She had sprung into it full-fledged like a newly made butterfly. At Josie Fleming's party, certain in the fashionable set had discovered that she was pretty, and well-mannered and graceful, and the gentlemen liked her, and she helped to entertain some who had heretofore been hard to entertain, and she was Dr. Copeland's daughter, and ought to be noticed, so they noticed her. A tea party to-day, a ride to-morrow, a social evening with a few friends the next day, and the days flew by. To each and all of these gatherings came Eben Bruce. For the explanation of his sudden freedom from business restraints and the lavish expenditures in which he joined, I shall have to go back a little and tell you of an added misfortune which has recently befallen him. There was a certain well-to-do old uncle, his mother's brother, on whom neither Eben nor his mother had built a single hope, for the reason that the crusty old man was offended with them both. He had earned a fair sum of money in the soap business, and, having no sons of his own, was willing to help his nephew into a comfortable position in the same establishment where he commenced life. He took care to explain the successive steps by which Eben might rise to having an acknowledged name in the firm and a voice in its decisions. But Eben hated the sight and the sound and the smell of soap. He would make no promises, offer no thanks, feel no gratitude. He never could or would be a soap dealer. He wanted to be a physician, and a physician he meant to be. His mother was partly on his side, and partly on the brother's. When she talked with Eben, she spoke boldly of the money advantages of such an offer, and of the possibility that the uncle, having no son, and only one daughter of his own, might leave his nephew a handsome little sum to help him increase his business. When she talked with the uncle, she hinted at the greater respectability of a profession and the evident talent that Eben had for professional life. The question was an open one for so many months that finally all parties grew irritable under the strain. Eben declared himself sick and tired of the whole ill-smelling subject, and hoped that nothing would ever be said about it again in his presence. Mrs. Bruce alternately told her son that he had no regard for his mother's comfort, and her brother that he had no sympathy with a talented young man's aspirations after something higher. The uncle finally closed the matter by declaring that his nephew might aspire to the moon if he wanted to, and turn pill vender as quick as he pleased, but he need not then, nor ever, expect a penny's worth of help from him. And, to do them justice, they did not. Eben secured a clerkship and spent his evenings in earnest work over medical books; and, up to the day when he attended the picnic in such company as Satan, being on the alert, furnished for him, while the Lord's servants were busy here and there, had held steadily to his purpose. But the uncle, as the years went by, buried his daughter and then his wife, and finally, when in a sudden accident he lost his life while trying to save another, it was found that his will, carefully made and deposited in his lawyer's safe, dated but a few days after his wife's death, left all his nice little property to his nephew, Eben Bruce. News of this sudden uplift in his affairs followed hard on the telegram which announced the uncle's death. So Eben Bruce, who had not intended to take the long journey, changed his mind, threw up his clerkship, and he and his mother went, in deep mourning, to the funeral of the soap dealer. It might not be a pleasant way to make money, but the money proved to be very pleasant to spend, after it was made. Life is certainly a great bewilderment. I often wonder what the hard-working men would say if they could suddenly come back among the living and see the ways in which their fortunes are being used. One cannot help honoring the old uncle for choking down his anger and his sense of ill-treatment and making his nephew his heir. Yet I suppose that of all the misfortunes which happened to Eben Bruce that winter, the most to be regretted was the one which brought him into possession of a small fortune to do with as he would. The spirit which had been recently roused in him was just the one to be fostered by the knowledge that he had money without working for it, and unlimited time at his disposal. He began well. He set his mother at ease in a boarding house that was suited to her taste, with a comfortable bank account for her use. Then he went back to Eastwood and made prompt arrangements to enter Dr. Copeland's office as a student. It was found to be eminently convenient for Dr. Copeland to have his medical student board with him. So this change was effected. Lloyd McLean looked on at the packing, and even assisted in the preparations for his room-mate's flitting, making, the while, certain dolorous and at the same time comic speeches which covered a sigh over the easier lot of his fellow student. "Well, old fellow, good-bye," he said, as they swung the old hair trunk into the hall and watched the porter downstairs. "This is the last of you. One of these days, I suppose, I shall wait for 5 mortal hours in your reception room, waiting my turn to consult the great Dr. Bruce, and my errand will be to see if you will be so kind as to lend a poor student a work on corns, or bunions, or something or other, that he may study up a case. I shall be grey by that time, and worn to a skeleton, but I shall just have reached the happy hour when I can give all my time to the aforesaid work, with no money with which to buy it; and I shall look up at you with tears in my eyes, and say, 'Sir, I remember you in your earlier days, before the sun of prosperity had dawned upon you. In memory of those old times when we used to eat hash and cod balls together, I trust you will lend me the book.'" And so, with much laughter and nonsense, these two who had been intimately associated for several months, shook hands and their lives separated. This will account in part for the fact that Eben Bruce ran down rapidly, without the knowledge of his friend. It was easier to do it now. The medical student occupied the room adjoining the doctor's office, and let himself in at any hour of the night, disturbing no one, and appeared always at the breakfast table, hollow-eyed it is true, and looking wretchedly overworked, calling upon himself the sympathies of the family, and the warning of the busy doctor not to study late. It did not pay in the end. It was not that Eben Bruce intended to ruin himself. It was not that he sought out evil companions and went to ruin with them. He drank, for the most part, alone. It was not that he drank what most men would call to excess. It was simply that his sensitively organized, easily excited brain rebelled against the smallest portion of liquid fire. It was simply an unnatural taste for alcohol which had slumbered all unsuspected in his brain, and which had been handed down to him through generations of men who were not drunkards, but who took beer and wine and brandy as tonics, respectably under the physician's orders. Poor Eben Bruce, with his finer nerves and his higher grade of intellect and his keener sensibilities, could not take these things as tonics, could not be respectable even under the physician's orders. His mother was at fault. She had sipped her beer when he was a creeping baby, to give her strength to care for him. He never thought of blaming his mother for the fire that burned in his veins, and had roused into power the first taste of alcohol. Blessed ignorance of babyhood! He did not know that she was to blame. Miserable ignorance of motherhood! She did not know it either. Neither did she know that he was going swiftly down. She rejoiced over him during those days. They were all ignorant together. Have you never looked on with wide open eyes that wondered and wondered at the blindness of some concerning their nearest and dearest? Least of all did Fannie Copeland understand. She knew that her father's medical student was coming daily into closer relations with her, that he had dropped the formal Miss Copeland. She was Fannie to him now. In fact, occasionally, when they were quite alone, he had surprised her in some moment of excitement over a discussion by an eager, "My dear Fannie." She had blushed and tried to look unconscious over the slip of the tongue, but acknowledged to herself that it was a very sweet slip, and he spoke the words as though they might have meant a good deal to him. And so the sweet dream went on. The mother looked on not altogether unanxious. She asked the doctor whether his student was perfectly satisfactory, and how long it would be before he could begin to practice. And just what was the sum his uncle left him? Occasionally she said to herself with a half sigh that Fannie was so pretty and so bright, she had hoped, or rather she had fancied, and then she did not tell even herself what she had fancied, but said hastily, "No matter, if they are really attached to each other, and he is a good young man, why, happiness is the best thing after all." And she thought tenderly of her own poor doctor, who had never yet seen the year in which he did not have to plan carefully so as to hold up his head out of debt, when the annual looking over of accounts fell due. This woman had had other opportunities, more brilliant, but she thought of them with a smile, and knew that one day with the doctor was worth them all. It might be the same with Fannie. And she did not touch by so much as a heart-throb the one element in the case which might mean misery and danger for Fannie. The doctor was equally blind. More so, indeed. Manlike, he looked upon his daughter Fannie as a child under her mother's care. Eben Bruce's attentions were the natural outgrowth of the native politeness of a young fellow whom circumstances had thrown into daily contact with the child. Nothing was serious except the cases of fever and lung troubles which he had on hand just now, and which kept him busy all day and anxious day and night. Perhaps the boy Holly was the only one who could be said to be wide awake. With the peculiar interest which is sometimes so marked in thoughtful boys, he held aloof from Eben Bruce. Not that he disliked him, or was rude to him, or indeed had much to do with him in any way. He seemed simply to stand apart and watch him. "Why doesn't Bruce go to the temperance meetings?" he asked one day, suddenly, as the family lingered at the tea-table waiting for the belated doctor to finish his meal. The student had excused himself and gone to the office to execute a commission for the doctor. "To the temperance meetings?" repeated his sister. what meetings? Where are they?" "Why, down in the hall. They have them every Friday night. Good ones, too. Ever so many people sign the pledge. If you were not so busy going to parties and things, you would know all about them." "Do you think Mr. Bruce in special need of attending the meetings, my boy?" It was Mrs. Copeland who asked the question, her voice pleasant, her eyes smiling. She did not know enough about the young man's habits to even imagine that there might be a sting in the question. Holly sent a swift look after his sister, and spoke quickly. "Why, mother, as to that, I think there is a special need of everybody going. Mr. Cleveland goes, and young McLean, and hosts of men who never drink at all." "They are trying to save the drunkards; a kind effort, certainly, but it seems to me rather a hopeless one." The mother's voice was still composed. She had no drunkard to save; she had only a passing interest in any effort of the kind. Holly hesitated. There was something he wanted to say, but he was not sure of the wisdom or the kindness of it. Still he ventured. "I guess they are trying to save some who may be drunkards when they get older, if they don't get started right now. I know one thing, if I were a girl I wouldn't have anything to do with a fellow who wouldn't sign the pledge, not in these times." Fannie laughed, though there was a jarring note in the laughter. "Why, Holly," she said, "have you been engaged to champion the cause? Seems to me you are rather young for a lecturer." "I am not too young to coax people to sign the pledge. I urged Mr. Bruce for half an hour, yesterday, and he refused." "Why do you particularly want him to sign?" Mrs. Copeland was the questioner. Her voice simply expressed amusement. The zeal of this young champion for temperance was not all unpleasant to her, but seemed to have the natural overdrawn element of youth in it. "Why, mother, for the same reason that I asked others, to get his name and his influence on the right side. And because—" the truthful boy hesitated, and his cheeks flushed. There was another reason. "Because I thought he might need its help himself. Father, may I be excused and take that package round to Dunlap's now?" "Yes," said his father, "and I must be excused. They are waiting for me at Stewart's, I dare say. By the way, my dear, poor old Joe Hartzell is gone. Died this morning. I suppose poor Kate will need a little help now." "Dead, is he?" said Mrs. Copeland. "Poor wretch! I suppose that is what has just now fired Holly's zeal afresh." But Fannie still played with her spoon. Her cheeks flushed. "Mamma," she said at last, "I think Holly goes among those grown people too much, and gets made too much of. He is growing impudent. The idea of his speaking to Mr. Bruce as he did! And setting up his judgment about the pledge!" "Oh, no," said the mother, "he doesn't mean to be impudent. It is just boyish enthusiasm. He asks everybody to sign the pledge. Why, he coaxed his father into it the other night. I reminded him that he could not take a hot drink, with brandy in it, now, after he had been out in the cold, and he said he would give up all the hot drinks in the country for the boys' sake. And after all, Fannie, we may be glad that his energy takes such a turn. It is a dreadful town. Suppose he went to the bad? Your father was telling me, only last night, of meeting a man who used to know John Hartzell when he was a splendid young man in college. And look at him now. Think what it would be to have a drunkard in our family, Fannie. Holly may better extract pledge signers all over the country than take any such direction. Besides, the temperance meetings are sustained by the very first people. You heard Holly say that Mr. Cleveland always attends them." "Oh, I am not saying anything against their temperance meetings," Fannie said, with a restless air. "It is a grand thing to try to get hold of the drunkards, I suppose. But Holly ought not to be permitted to insult young men who haven't time to indulge in such work. I am sure papa thinks Mr. Bruce is overdoing as it is." End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of One Commonplace Day by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Where is John? But Miss Fannie Copeland was not to get away from the temperance question that day. It followed her upstairs to her pretty room. She heard Holly's voice below, he had brought the mail, and her mother called to her that there was a letter from Mildred. She went to the head of the stairs to receive it, and promised to come down presently and read it aloud, for her mother was very fond of Mildred. But Fanny did not read that letter to her mother. It was a long letter. There was a brief account of home engagements and plans, and then the writer plunged into the subject which evidently filled her heart. "And now, dear Fanny, at the risk of seeming to force your confidence, I want to ask you whether there is any truth in the rumor which reaches me through outside parties, that you are very intimate with that Mr. Bruce. We are dear friends, Fanny, you and I, and you must forgive me for speaking plainly. I hope there is nothing in it, because I am afraid for that young man. There is a lady in the mission rooms who has a brother belonging to one of the departments. He visited her yesterday, and had just returned from Eastwood. He visits at the Flemings. You may have seen him, though he says he did not meet you there last week. Well, he had a number of Eastwood names, and among them that of young Bruce. He said it is common report in Fred Fleming's set that the young man is drinking. Fred Fleming declared that it was so, and that something ought to be done to save him. Poor Fred needs saving, you know. It is pitiful, is it not, to think of his trying to save another from coming after him on the downward road?" "Fanny, I have not been able to think of anything else since I talked with that young man. I am afraid that the reports about Mr. Bruce's habits are too true. It seems this young man, whose name is Weston, used to know a family by the name of Bruce, and interested himself to discover whether this was any connection. So he heard much about him from several sources. I don't credit the report of your intimacy, and shall not, until I hear it from you, because I know how fond Eastwood is of gossiping in those directions. I hope to receive a letter from you by return mail, telling me that it is all nonsense. Still, Fanny dear, I have such a sore heart that I cannot help warning you, even though I hope and pray that it may be unnecessary. You remember Leonard Airedale, of course? You remember how sure you were that he did not drink wine? I liked to hear you say so, yet I did not believe it even then. Something about him made me afraid. I persisted until I found that he did. When he went to Chicago, he was under a very solemn promise to me not to touch another drop. I tried to have him sign a regular pledge, but that he would not do. He said that he considered the pledge made to me more sacred. Fanny, he has gone down, down. Broken that pledge, and every other that an honorable man could. I have been rescued, I suppose, from the depths. I thank God for saving me, but it has been at the expense of a sore heart. That is why I am writing all this to you. I hope I am coming before there has been time for any sick hearts. Fanny, my dear friend, don't trust a man who ever touches a drop of alcohol for medicine, or in any other conceivable way. It has been Leonard Airedale's ruin. Don't trust the common promise of any man who has ever tasted the stuff. There is a demon in it to drag men down. I would not trust any man, save on his knees, asking God's grace to help him keep the pledge which he has taken before God and men. A man who will not take a pledge to help him keep from doing what he says he does not intend to do, is, I believe, in 99 cases out of 100, not sincere, and wants to leave a loophole for his possible indulgence. And any young man who in the light of to-day does not stand squarely in the front of the battle and work with brain and voice, and vote for the cause of total abstinence, is, I believe, not sincere. How can he be, when everybody admits that souls are being ruined by the curse of liquor? Then am I not bound to lift up my voice, and, as soon as I can get a chance, give my vote against it? Suppose I accomplish nothing, has God ever asked me to accomplish? Has he not simply asked me to try? If I try and try and try and fail, will he hold me accountable for the failure? But if I do not try, simply because it seems almost certain that I shall fail, am I free from responsibility? Forgive me, Fanny, I did not mean to write you a temperance lecture, but I feel deeply on this whole question. It has burned me. I would not have you suffer a fraction of what I have. Let me beg you, dear friend, to open your eyes very wide to this question, and take such ground as you will wish you had when we stand at the judgment with all the ruined fathers and sons and brothers and husbands and lovers who are going to meet us there." There was much more, but I have given you enough to show you that Fanny Copeland had her warning. I cannot tell you that she heeded it lightly. She was indignant over it. She cried over it. She was fearful over it. That very Friday evening, when young Bruce came into her mother's parlor and asked if he might rest there until it was time to go to the train for the doctor, she proposed that instead they go, he and she, to the temperance meeting in the hall, and go from there to the train. He had 15 excuses. The night was dark and unusually damp. He was sure her father would not like to have her out. It was a long walk from the hall to the train. Her father was to bring an important piece of medical machinery with him, which must be transported from the train to the office with great care. He should need to take the sleigh. It was not large enough for 3. The proposition began to look unreasonable. Why didn't he attend those meetings occasionally? He had not time. Was he interested in the question? Well, yes, in a sense, all men were. He did not believe in the extreme measures of some. In fact, he was not fanatically inclined in any direction, he believed. And yet Eben Bruce's conscience said to him then and there, "Bruce, you are talking like a fool. If anybody ought to be a fanatic on this subject, you ought, and you know it." Had he signed the pledge? Why, no, he hadn't. When he was a youngster, his mother had not approved of pledges. A little of the old notion clung to him now, he supposed. Then his conscience said again, "No, it isn't, Eben Bruce. That is all nonsense. You have proved it in argument. It is a new notion which clings to you, a feeling that you cannot consent to put it out of your power, morally speaking, to indulge that horrible craving for alcohol which sometimes comes upon you. You are too weak to want to do it, though you hate its chains and are afraid of its power." "Don't you believe in pledges of any kind?" asked Fanny. The young man, under a spell of the earnest eyes which were looking at him, more full of soul than they ever had been before, arose and went over to her side, and dropped into the seat before her, and said, "Yes, I do. I believe in our pledging ourselves, now and here, to be the best and dearest friends to each other that the world has ever known. Will you take that pledge with me, Fanny?" That was a master stroke of the enemy. Fanny, startled, flushed, confused, pleased, forgot caution and fear and the future, and the golden opportunity passed. It was a decent and decorous funeral that they gave the body of poor old Joel Hartzell. Dr. Brandon came and conducted the service. He was no stranger to the house by this time. He had knelt frequently by the silent old man during the weeks past, and asked God to have mercy on his soul. He was familiar with the story of those last days. He had himself seen a gleam of intelligence on the old face that last time he called, and heard a murmured "Amen" to his petition. On the whole, Dr. Brandon read the words, "It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power," over the bruised and battered and sadly ill-used old body, with a sense of awe and wonder and grave delight, such as he did not often experience. To think that there was a Saviour great enough and good enough not only to forgive old Joel Hartzell, but to raise up for him a glorious body, without spot or wrinkle, or any such thing. "Verily, we have a wonderful Saviour," he said to Mr. Cleveland, as the two stood together over the wreck that life and death had made, and saw, both of them, the look of something almost like dignity that the old face had taken up in its last sleep. "Aye, that we have," said Mr. Cleveland. "And their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more. That is wonderful, too. No human being can think of old Joel as a saint, but God will." Miss Wainwright's carriage held John and his wife and Kate. Mr. Cleveland's carriage led the way, with the minister beside him. And there followed a carriage which held Miss Wainwright and Miss Hunter, and another with the doctor and Holly. This little bit of thoughtfulness touched Kate almost more than any of the numberless other kindnesses had. It was so unexpected, and, in the eyes of the world, so unnecessary. Do you know just how strange the house to which they returned seemed to them? It was in nice order. The bed had been neatly made up, and was empty. The little stand which had stood at the head of the bed, and held glasses and spoon, and lamp, all needful things, was empty, save for the little lamp, which, newly filled, stood waiting for them. Kate lighted it, for the early twilight was already setting in, and shaded it from the bed; then quickly took the shade away. There was no need for it now. She sat down in the rocking chair, which had been brought from somewhere weeks ago, for her comfort, and folded her hands and looked about her. It was a strange feeling. She was at leisure. The occupation which had held body and mind for weeks was gone. There was a strange sense of desolation. She had not thought to deeply mourn her father, but one night, that last night of his life, he had said to her, "Kiss me, Kate, you used to when you were a little girl. Poor Kate, I shall be out of your way in a little while. I meant to take such good care of you. I promised her I would, and I didn't. I don't know but she will be disappointed at seeing me. Do you think she will?" And Kate had answered quickly, "Oh, no, father, oh, father, no. She will be glad, and I will come." "And John?" he had said quickly, with an upward inflection in his voice; and she had said it after him assuringly, "And John." It took with her all the sacredness of a pledge. As she thought of this last talk, the tears came thick and fast. She was missing her father. Yet there was a strange sweetness in the tears. It was so blessed to think that he lived even so little bit of a life that could be sweetly missed. Mrs. John Hartzell went about softly preparing the neat supper. She was sorry for Kate. She had never thought to feel a shadow of regret for the father whom she had known only as a trial; but there had been some last words, in the stillness of the night, spoken also to her. She did not tell them, but she treasured them. Thus in silence and peace the evening gathered around them. Suddenly wife and sister awoke at once to the same question, a startled look in the eyes of both. "Where is John?" "He went home with the chairs from the corner," Mrs. Hartzell said, "and he said that while he was about it he would step down to Dunlap's and get a little flour. I must bake to morrow, and the flour is all gone. But I thought he would be back before this time. I told him we would have tea early." Kate gave a quick little exclamation, as quickly suppressed, but it sounded a note of warning to the wife. She looked up, startled. "Why, Kate, you don't think—" And then she stopped. Her face blanched with fear. She had not thought of it before. It was so easy to learn to trust one's husband when one wants to trust him, and John's step had been so firm during the past weeks. It was not possible that she was to be plunged back into the living death from which she had been creeping up. Could she bear it? Would not the merciful grave which they had seen closed that afternoon open again and take her in? Could she bear the suspense for an hour? She rose up and began to walk rapidly back and forth in the little room. "Kate," she said fiercely, "you don't think, you can't believe—" "I don't know," said Kate, drawing a hard, slow breath. "John is tired. He has been under a heavy strain, and he has been excited all day. And there are fiends abroad in the town." Do you think they will ever forget that evening, these two women, sitting beside the empty bed watching out of the west window and the south window? Glancing now and then at the untasted supper on the table, listening to the dreary song of the neglected tea kettle, listening constantly for the sound of footsteps which came not. They did not sit inertly. They went, first the wife and then the sister, out into the night and the darkness, down the steps, down the lane, out to first one corner and then the other, and crept back after a little, alone, frightened, almost maddened with anxiety and fear. Before the midnight of that awful night was reached, earth seemed to the two to contain nothing sweeter than that lately closed grave. Oh, to be hidden out of sight and sound within its quiet arms! It was midnight when John Hartzell came home. His wife was out on the steps peering down into the darkness. She heard him, stumbling, swearing, knocking violently at a post which he fancied ran against him. She shrank into shadow as he passed her. But she need not have cowered back, he was too drunk to see her in the dim twilight. He stumbled into the house and sank down a limp heap on the broken step. "Oh, God," she said, "oh, God!" Do you think it was not a prayer, and that the pitying God will not see that she is avenged? Kate had fled to the little closet room, from whence, after the drunkard had thrown himself on that neat and so recently vacated bed, and was lost to sound, she stole out in search of the wife. "Oh, Annie," she said in low and pitiful tones, "poor Annie, come in, dear. You will die out here in the cold. He will not hear us. Come, let me help you in." And the poor wife looked up at the young girl, her eyes tearless, her face white with agony. But she only repeated that solemn, awful name, "Oh, God!" "God is in heaven, Annie, and he hears. Be sure he hears. The time is coming when he will avenge his own. We belong to him, Annie, and father belongs to him. Let me help you in." And she fairly lifted the stricken wife in her arms and bore her into that closet where the rest of that night was spent. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of One Commonplace Day by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Only a question of time. How did it happen? Who can tell all the hows of these things? Why is it that just at the wrong moment people who have been on the alert for weeks must relax their vigilance? On almost any other evening of the previous month it would have been impossible for John Hartzell to have eluded all the friends who were bent on saving him. But on this particular evening they went their various ways, apparently so satisfied because God had interposed and forever saved old Joel Hartzell, that they forgot the human side of the struggle and went home to rest. Mr. Cleveland, in slippers and dressing gown, sat before his open grate and told his mother about the look of dignity with which death had touched even the old man's features, and said, reverently, "Though I believe it was not death, but immortal life, which left that impress. Is it not wonderful to think of old Joel in heaven?" It was about that time that old Joel's son descended again into the mouth of hell. He did not intend it. Oh no, I do not suppose there has yet lived a man who intended deliberately to descend from respectability into ruin. He returned the chairs, and in a grave and manly way expressed his thanks. He went into the grocery and bought and paid for a small sack of flour. In doing so he took out and held in his hand for a moment several quarters and a $50 while he counted out the change. I will not say that there was not a sense of satisfaction in so doing. There was such a recent past in which to have counted out money for flour would have seemed to him almost a miracle. The grocer was friendly, and held him for a moment in conversation. He had ordered him from his doorstep more than once, but if a man was going to be respectable and jingle money in his pocket, it was as well to look out for custom. On the steps stood two young fellows, gay, thoughtless, not exactly heartless, save as rum had silenced their higher natures. "Look at John," said one. "He is counting out the quarters as though they grew on the Flats." "They are crowing over him down at the temperance meetings. He is quite the fashion, I hear. A brand plucked from the burning. Still, I heard that he wouldn't sign their pledge." "Oh no, he won't. He prides himself, they say, on his iron will. Think of John Hartzell with a will so iron that a glass of whiskey wouldn't bend him." Then they laughed. "Do you suppose he will stick?" This from a third young man, one with a meaner face than the others. One of those low, laughing faces belonging to the fellow who has sunken low enough to do anything just for a joke. "Stick? No, of course he won't. It is only a question of a few days. When one sees the disgusting fuss that is being made over him, one is tempted to wish that he would hurry up and get back into the gutter. Did you see that parade at the funeral of old Joe today? Carriages and all that sort of thing. That fellow Cleveland who thinks he was born to rule the country leading the procession, looking as solemn as a priest. I would like to see that man brought down in some way. He is so far above the common people that he will hardly bow to them on the street." What is the meaning of this astonishing confusion of logic? Only personal pique and political differences of opinion. Mr. Cleveland did not, it is true, recognize this young man as a friend. They had not a thought in common. That they had quarreled could not be said, because Mr. Cleveland would not quarrel; but that they differed essentially on all questions was true, and in the nature of things necessary. Either oil or water must change its nature before both can mix. Then spoke the nature which was on the alert for fun. "It would be a rich thing to see the faces of the fanatics when their pet tumbles again." "I declare I should like to be around. I wonder how long the reform will last." "I wouldn't be afraid to wager that I could have him in a state which would edify my Lord Cleveland by 10 o'clock to night." "Oh, no, not so soon as that. He has just buried his father, you know." "What of that? Much he cared for his father. Haven't you heard him swear at him like a trooper? I tell you, John Hartzell is playing a game on the rich old maid. That is all he is about." "If I thought that, I'd like to expose him." Don't think I am going to give you the entire scene. I have only hinted at the motives which were brought to bear on the three natures as they stood on the steps and watched John Hartzell with his silver. They had never moved in his set, those three. They were several grades above him. It was, therefore, an added pat to his pride when they accosted him in a friendly way and expressed sympathy with him in his recent affliction. It was a most unusual thing that they should walk along the street with him. "Was he at work now on anything in particular?" asked the young fellow who was searching for fun. "Did he know Burton of the Lower Mill? He was looking for a reliable man to secure permanently. Perhaps Hartzell would like the chance. Step in here and let us wait for him. He will pass presently on his way uptown." "In here" was a saloon of the better sort. It had a soda fountain in summer and a refreshment table in winter where oysters were served, and it was patronized occasionally by thoughtless temperance people when they wanted cigars or oysters, and did not want to go uptown any farther. John did not hesitate. He had reformed. He never meant to drink another drop of intoxicating liquor. He was as ignorant of his own heart as ever a baby was. He prided himself on his strong will. He was not afraid to go into saloons. "Have a glass of beer, Hartzell? No? You have discarded the whole thing, have you? Why, I thought beer was innocent enough. Well, some people have to deny themselves, I suppose." Was there a covert sneer in the tone? Was there a hint that he could not drink a glass of beer if he wanted to? Wild and preposterous to you as it may seem, he honestly thought he could. What, John Hartzell, who only a few weeks before had told Miss Wainwright that he had tried 1,000 times to give up the stuff, and could not? Yes, the very man. Don't you see, he had done it. 6 weeks since a drop of liquor had been tasted. The work was accomplished, so he thought. The battle fought. He was a free man now. Yet the smell of that beer, as the gentleman quaffed it, made him fairly dizzy with its suggestions. And yet he was not warned. Don't expect me to explain it. I verily believe there is no human explanation which can fit the story. But don't you know by your own observation all about the strange, blind infatuation and foolhardiness of the reformed drunkards who are trusting to their own will power? If you do not, you are certainly not a very experienced temperance worker. Where were the temperance workers that evening? Why did there not pass by a man who could help this tempted soul who yet did not understand himself well enough to know that he was in mortal danger? One passed by who might have helped. At least, he might have tried. He did not go blindly. He paused and thought of the danger. That one was Charlie Lambert. A temperance man? Oh, yes, he drank no liquor. He had no temptation to drink any. A pledged man? Oh, no, he saw no occasion for that. Certainly not, so far as he was concerned. An advocate of the license system? Well, hardly, and yet it was certainly better to have this thing regulated by law if people must have it among them. Oh, then he believed in getting it out from among them? Well, no, he did not consider that expedient. In fact, it was something which could not be done. Why not? Well, the country was not ready for it. How was the country to be gotten ready for it? By continuing to accept the business as legal and under protection? Oh, well, he was not a fanatic on this subject. He believed in individual opinion. And in this way could Charlie Lambert dance around in a peck measure for a whole week at a time, and call it arguing. Still, he did not believe in drunkards. Oh, no, it was a disgraceful thing to get drunk. In fact, I tell you he did not believe in moderate drinking. He had not so much excuse as that for his slippery position. He knew John Hartzell, and he saw him distinctly in that saloon, and paused, and said to himself, "That is no place for that fellow. He ought to know better." Why didn't he go in, and at least look as much in the face of John Hartzell? There was one curious reason why he did not. 1, 2, 3, 5 young men he saw in there, who were acquaintances of his. Friends indeed, in a general way. The proprietor of the saloon was a good fellow. He often took his lunch at that place. He had stopped there for soda almost every day during the summer. What an embarrassing thing for a young man like him to step in there and try to rescue John Hartzell. It was too much to expect. After all, John might be only waiting for something. Besides, he would go to drinking again, of course. No confidence could be placed in the reformation of such drunkards as he. And Charlie Lambert passed by on the other side. "Come now," said the gentlemanly proprietor. "You fellows are getting too noisy. We don't have such scenes in here. Some of you must get Hartzell out of here. This is no place for him." This was 2 hours after Charlie Lambert had passed. By that time the respectable oyster saloon was no place for him. He must go lower down. One of the loungers agreed to take him by the arm and lead him away. "Coax him home, Jimmy," whispered the gentlemanly fellow who had started out for fun. He had had his fun, and someway it left a bitter taste. Jimmy nodded. But he might as well have undertaken to coax a panther back into its cage after it had scented its prey. What John Hartzell wanted now was rum, and rum he would have. A whistling boy went past just as he reeled into a more pronounced saloon lower down. The whistling stopped, and the boy stood for a moment horror-stricken. It was surely John Hartzell. What could he do? Where was everybody? He stood only a moment, then ran on swift feet around the corner. Dr. Brandon's house was the nearest, but Dr. Brandon was not at home. He hurried up the stairs to Lloyd McLean's boarding house, but Lloyd McLean's room was dark and his door was locked. Then home, father might have come and father would go to the rescue. No, Dr. Copeland had not returned. The boy was panting and almost breathless. He burst into the parlor, where sat Fanny and Mr. Bruce. He had but one question to ask. "Do you know where Mr. McLean is?" No, certainly Eben Bruce did not know. He had not seen McLean in a week. What was the matter? "They must have got hold of John Hartzell," Holly said, still breathless. "They are making him drink. If I knew where he was, I guess he would know something to do. He is with the others a great deal." The pronouns in the latter part of the sentence referred to Lloyd McLean. Then the boy rushed away. Fanny and her friend looked at each other. "Poor fellow," said Fanny. "He is almost wild over that wretch of a John Hartzell. He was so attached to Kate. He seems to be determined that John shall reform. I suppose nothing is more hopeless. It is only a question of time when people get as low as he." Eben Bruce shivered a little. "Yes," he said slowly, "I suppose it is only a question of time." Holly rushed to his mother. "Oh, mother, if you would let me just run down to Mr. Cleveland's. I can go in 15 minutes. I came home at 9:30 as you said. But they have got hold of him, the fellows have, and they are making him drink. Mr. Cleveland would know what to do. May I go, mother? Say yes, quick, do, please. I have lost so much time already." Could she let him go? He was only a boy, and the streets were full of snares for boys, and it was the wildest sort of an idea. What could Mr. Cleveland or any man do? Poor miserable wretch! Of course he would drink. As if anybody did not know that. She was sorry for Kate. Yes, she was genuinely sorry. She had sent her a black cashmere dress to wear to the funeral, and a black wrap, which she told her to keep. But Kate had been utterly wild to hope anything for that miserable brother. It was a good thing that the father had died. It was an infinite pity that the brother had not died years ago. Holly must not think of such a thing as going out again. It would do no good. It might do great harm. Then Holly went away to his room. He kissed his mother good night, mournfully, his lip quivering and quivering, so that he could hardly bear it. Once in his room, the door locked, he sat down, all hot and trembling as he was, and cried great burning tears. Then he walked up and down the room, even as Kate and John Hartzell's wife were doing at that moment. "I hate it," he said, clenching his hard young fist. "I hate it. I wish I were a man this minute. I would do lots of things. I would have rooms, bright, light rooms, and people on the watch, and a man at every corner to run to when folks were in trouble, and I would fight it all ways at once, and I will. I'll fight until there is not a drop to be had on the globe. That's the thing. None to be had. Then they can't get it. That will end the matter, and I believe it is the only thing that will. God wants it so, for he says that no drunkard shall go to heaven, and rum makes drunkards, and always has, and always will. Then people who want folks to go to heaven have got to get rid of the rum. There is no other way." I am glad to tell you that this boy got down at last on his knees. There he sobbed out his bitter story, and from thence he arose calmed. He had done what he could. It is true that the sum of it had been nothing. But the divine heart whispered to him, "Never mind, my boy. God knows, and God reigns." Well, there is a rift, I suppose, in every cloud, however dark. In the midst of all these bitter scenes, Holly Copeland's education was progressing. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of One Commonplace Day by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Vigilance Committee. They had heard it the next day. Lloyd McLean was told by his old friend Eben Bruce. "Were you found last night by a young whirlwind?" he asked, as the two met on the street and shook hands, and then Eben explained and was questioned and cross-questioned. "No, you don't tell me that the fiends got hold of him. Confound this thing. Eben, you and I ought to go into it with a will. I hear of new victims every day. Who knows what will come next? You look wretchedly, Eben. Are you overworking or what? No need to rush so now, man. Why don't you take it easily? And nobody went to the rescue as far as you know? That was dreadful. What were you about that you did not go yourself?" He waited for no answers, but hurried away. At the post office door stood Mr. Cleveland. "Have you heard?" began Lloyd, and then stopped. Yes, he had heard, and his face had actually seemed to age under it. "I am broken down," he said, almost tremulously. "I dare not go around there, McLean. What can we do? If he only had felt less confidence in himself. If I had only stayed with him last night. But I did not dream, and yet I might have known. It was just the time." If the young fellow who had been the evening before in search of fun could have looked on the foiled worker's face just then, he might have seen effect enough certainly to have afforded him fun of his sort for some time to come. There was more of it at the Hartzell home, whither Mr. Cleveland presently went. "Where is he?" he asked, holding out his hand to Kate, saying not another word. "We do not know." "What! They told me he came home. They watched him, some of them." "Yes, and we let him slip away." Her face crimsoned as she said it. "I don't know how we could, but I was frightened for Annie. After I got her into the house she had a sort of fit. I could not rouse her, and then she moaned and cried in an unnatural way; and when, hours after, she grew quiet, and I thought her asleep, I would not move for fear of disturbing her, and I sat and held her. When at last she stirred, and sat up, and looked about her, she said, 'I haven't been asleep. Did you hear a noise? I am afraid he is gone.' We came out here at once, and he had. It was just in the gray morning, just at the time that father went home, Mr. Cleveland. I heard no noise, but Annie thinks she did. She thinks he must have awakened enough himself to remember, and then, in shame and misery, have slipped away from us. She mourned so that she was not beside him to have held him. I don't know what to do with her. I am afraid she will lose her reason." She looked like it. Hollow-eyed woman. No tears to shed. Her eyes looked as though they might burn rather than weep. Mr. Cleveland gave her his hand in utter silence. He felt rebuked, appalled. Had he been unfaithful to his trust? Why did he not stay by the wreck until it was placed in safer harbor? He who knew so well that wreckers were abroad. The wife was the first to speak. "We must find him, Mr. Cleveland." Some way the words gave him courage. "Yes," he said quickly, "and we must save him. It will not do to sit down and count all lost because he has fallen again. Perhaps we should have expected that." Before he could say more, there was a rush up the broken step, and Holly Copeland stood beside them. "Oh, Kate," he began, his voice eager, I did not get anything done, but I tried so hard. And, Kate, I'll tell you, while the rum is all over, as it is, there is no way to do but to watch it and fight it all the time. We must just get rid of it, or there will be no peace, ever." He said it in such a tone of quiet conviction, as though that question were settled for all time, that Mr. Cleveland could hardly forbear a smile. Then Holly had his story to tell, and its recital did not make the self-reproachings of the man who listened any easier to bear. "We were all unfaithful," said Kate. "Annie and I ought to have held him. I did not think. It seemed to me last night that for hours my heart would only take in one thought, and that was that father was safe forever." "God saved father, and God must save John. Nobody else can." It was the wife who spoke, and her words took hold of the listeners with the power of a conviction. "Amen," said Mr. Cleveland. Then came a conference as to what to do first. "Is your faith equal to the strain?" This was the question which Mr. Cleveland asked of Kate as he turned to her to say good bye. They had planned what there was to do. For the women it was that hardest part, to wait at home. In the meantime, men were to be placed on the alert, a sort of impromptu Vigilance Committee formed, whose first object would be to decoy John Hartzell back to his home. After that they must plan the next step. It was not to be easy work. They all felt that. John Hartzell had been too hard a drunkard to yield the struggle easily, now that the demon was roused again. "I do not know," Kate said, a wan smile on her face. "I do not know whether the name of it is faith or presumption. When he saved father, it seems to me such an easy thing for him to save John, if only John will." "Yes," the listener said, "that is the only 'if.' God must be true to himself, or he would not be God." Then he went away and left them to their harder task. All day the watching and the searching availed nothing. Apparently John Hartzell had dropped from the ranks of the living as completely as his father had. Perhaps the most disgusted member of the Vigilance Committee was Lloyd McLean. In his eager search all the early part of the evening, for it was not until evening that he could be released from office duty to enter systematically upon his work, he came in contact with more of the low and revolting features of rum than he had ever even imagined. "No, he ain't here, my hearty," said a drunken wretch in answer to the young man's inquiry as he opened the door of one of the lowest dens. "I ain't seen John Hartzell this blessed day. Shouldn't wonder if he had gone and drowned himself out of respect to his father. It is a great thing to lose a father. I lost one once myself. Come in and have a drink in memory of it. I know you. Why, yes, of course I do. You're one of us, ain't you? I saw you the other night up at the hall, when them fellows was whimpering around with their pledge. We don't sign no pledges, do we, you and me? We believe in liberty of conscience and free speech and all that sort of thing, don't we? Come in, my friend, and treat the resolution to be men. No, sir, no pledges for us." And he gave the disgusted young man a familiar slap on the shoulder, as he would have done to a boon companion. Lloyd McLean slammed the door hard, to drown the coarse laughter of those who were not too drunk to appreciate the joke, and walked down the street with a face whose colour deepened as he thought. The hall where the temperance meetings were held was the place of rendezvous for the searchers, and thither he went to find Cleveland alone. "Any news?" asked the latter eagerly. "No, there isn't. I haven't received the suspicion of a trail. I say, Cleveland, I've seen and heard enough to-night to make a man feel sure that there must be a place in reserve for lost souls. And I've seen something else. I wish it were Friday night. I hope we can work up such a rousing meeting as this town has never seen. And if you will have 50 total abstinence pledges here, I will sign them all. And then let us organize a permanent league and have a fund and go to work in dead earnest. This thing has been handled with gloves on long enough. I tell you what it is, I'm roused." "Good," said Mr. Cleveland. "The saloons are getting better than they imagine, after all. They are at work educating workers. But in the meantime, my friend, where is John Hartzell?" In order to explain to you where he was at that moment, I shall have to return to the Hartzell home and the people waiting there. Little had been said all day. Kate had prepared food with care and a certain degree of daintiness, prepared it with reference to the possibility of one coming who would be faint and burning with unnatural thirst. But no one came, and the food remained almost entirely untouched. Kate tried to sew, and seemed unable to set the stitches. She tried to read, and the words seemed only to be, "Where is John? Father is safe, but where is John?" Thus the day dragged its slow length away. Suddenly, as twilight was settling on them again, Mrs. Hartzell sprang up with a new determination in her face. "I'm going there to watch. I wonder I did not think of it before. I won't come back without him, Kate, you will see." "Where, Annie? Where are you going?" "To the little room. The little, bright room. Didn't Miss Hunter tell you about it? We passed it once, John and I, that night we took a walk, and I told him about it. I'm going there to watch. You stay here, Kate, and be ready if he should happen to come home. But I can't wait another minute. So many people keep going by that room, he must be among them." And Kate was silent. It was a dreary place for a young girl to sit down alone, with only a vacant bed and the thought of a grave to keep her company. But she could see that whether the bright little room ever did anything for John or not, it might save his wife's reason. So she helped her on with the worn bonnet and the faded shawl. And the poor creature, who had heard, before God, the pledge that she should be loved and cherished until death parted them, went her way to watch for the one from whom worse than death had parted her. All night she stayed alone in that bright room. People passed and passed, and talked and laughed and whistled and sang and swore. But John Hartzell was not among them. The town hushed itself into quiet after a while. But still that light burned, and the shades were stretched high. Miss Hunter slipped down from her room above once in a while, and looked on the watcher now kneeling by the window, looking up to the stars, and to the God above the stars, and shook her head and went back to pray. Once she came, and, touching the kneeling figure, said, "You are to eat a bite now. It won't do to be all run down when he comes, so that you haven't strength to hold on to him." The plea reached the watcher's mind, and she ate and drank with resolute air, like one who was resolved to be strong. Who would have supposed that the frail, sheltered, white-robed, pink-ribboned darling of the years long gone could wait and watch and endure like this? Yet the night and the day went by, and he did not pass. Where was he? Skulking. That is the only word for it. A miserable, shamefaced, utterly cowed, despairing man. He had drank to drunkenness, he had spent his last cent, he had pawned his hat, he had been kicked out, he had stumbled to his old home, he had slept the drunkard's sleep, he had awakened, not enough himself to realize his misery, but to realize only that he must have more rum. Yet rum he could not get. The Vigilance Committee was at work before he had made many attempts, and by 10 o'clock of the morning not a rumseller would have dared to furnish John Hartzell with liquor. There were certain who could have hinted as to his whereabouts at intervals during the day, had they chosen to do so, but it suited their policy to be entirely ignorant. So it was that, by evening of the second day, he was sober and desperate. He had lost all trust in himself, all hope in others. He had settled it a dozen times within the hour that he was a lost man, that there was no hope for him in this world or the next, that he wanted nothing, hoped for nothing, but liquor, and, unless he could have that, he should go mad. He had settled it that he would never go home again. He would get away as far as possible, then he would beg or steal or anything to get enough alcohol to kill him. This, as nearly as he can be said to have had a plan, was the plan of the miserable man who was hiding himself alike from enemies and friends. Mrs. Hartzell went home in the early morning, after her night's vigil. She shook her head in answer to Kate's inquiring look, but she shook it with a faint little smile. "Kate," she said, going over to her, "he has not come yet, but I think he will. I have something to tell you. I have learned to pray. Did you know it? I cannot think how I came to give way so entirely the other night after I had found God. I did not think I ever should again, but it came upon me so suddenly. Some way I had trusted him entirely. Now I am trusting God. He will not fail me. I think John will come." She did not say much more. She ate her breakfast steadily, with the air of one determined to conquer the utter want of appetite. She slept a good deal during the day, with the air of one preparing for conflict. At dusk she came out with the old bonnet on. "I hate to leave you alone, Kate, but you must stay, lest he should come, and I must go and watch, for fear he will not come." "I know," said Kate. She spoke as one almost awed. She did not know this resolute sister-in-law. She could but think that this was courage born of God. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of One Commonplace Day by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Night to Remember. Mr. Cleveland, when he came to learn if possibly something had been heard from the lost man at his home, found Kate there alone. "This will not do," he said positively, when he took in the situation. "It will not do at all. You cannot stay in such a neighborhood as this alone." "I must," said Kate, gravely, "and therefore I can. It is my part of this tragedy. We must not desert the only place he knows as home, lest he might come." "But is there not somebody to stay with you?" She shook her head. "Nobody from whom I do not shrink more than from solitude. There are few neighbors here, and those not of a sort to depend on in time of need." "Where is the woman whose baby died?" "Watching over the next one, who is also going to die. The world is full of sorrow for some, Mr. Cleveland." He turned from her abruptly, with the briefest possible good night. It was then 9 o'clock. He went with long, swift strides down the street, making no pauses until he reached Miss Wainwright's home. Then he gave such a jerk to the bell knob as brought that energetic woman herself, but a step behind, Keziah, to see what was the matter. "What is it?" she asked, the moment she caught sight of the messenger. "Any news?" No news at all. We are watching every street corner, and every rum hole in town. It does not seem possible, if he is alive, that he can elude us much longer. Miss Wainwright, she is quite alone in the house, in that neighborhood." "Who is?" "Kate, utterly alone, not even a neighbor to call upon. If he should come home in the night, raving, as he is liable to do, or if a dozen other things should happen, what would become of her?" "Where is the wife?" "Gone to Miss Hunter's bright little room to watch. It is a heaven-born idea, but it makes it no less desolate and dreadful for Kate. Can you think of anything to do? Is there some woman who can be hired to go there for the night?" "No," said Miss Wainwright, speaking slowly. "I do not suppose there is. At least, if there is, I am not acquainted with her. Miss Hunter would go, but she is looking after the poor wife, I suppose. Well, I asked the Lord to give me work in the cause. To be sure, I did not expect it to come in this form, but work isn't apt to come in the form in which you have planned it. I have always noticed that. I'll be ready in 10 minutes, Mr. Cleveland. Come in." "You!" said Mr. Cleveland. It was genuine astonishment. Miss Wainwright was never known to spend a night away from her beautiful old home. "To be sure, what else is there to do? Come in where it is warm. Keziah, get my things and bring the wicker basket I packed this afternoon. You can carry it, can't you, Mr. Cleveland? It isn't very heavy." "Keziah might go," she said, lowering her voice as she looked after the astonished handmaiden. "But Keziah, though a jewel in some respects, is a nuisance in others. The fact is, she is a coward. If I were to send her down there, I should expect her to die of 1,000 imaginary evils before morning, besides making a nuisance of herself generally to poor Kate. Oh, I'll go, of course. There is nothing else to do." "But you cannot walk there, my dear Miss Wainwright. I will go for my carriage. I can have it here in 10 minutes." "No, you won't. I can walk well enough if I choose. I am not over fond of walking, and I see no reason why I should do it for pleasure, since there is no pleasure in it. But I can walk on occasion, and would rather do it than ride after those horses of yours in the night, especially over on the Flats. Peter has a cold. I sent him home early with orders to soak his feet and go to bed, or you might go over for him. But there is no need, I can walk." She was as good as her word. Ready in less than 10 minutes, and they were out together in the clear starlight. As they passed the brightly lighted hall, Mr. Cleveland gave, incidentally, a bit of information. "We had the largest temperance meeting to night we have had at all, and the most enthusiastic one. Some of our friends are getting pretty thoroughly roused. This thing has stirred their blood. Lloyd McLean went forward the moment the opportunity was given, and put his name to the total abstinence pledge, and has been working like a general for signers ever since. I left the meeting in his charge when I came away." "Thank the Lord," said Miss Wainwright. There was a ring in her voice which he noticed as peculiar. "Why didn't you tell me that before?" she demanded. "I forgot for the moment that the ladies were not out at the meeting this evening. Why, are you particularly interested in him?" "I am particularly interested in all young men. And besides," added the truthful voice, after a moment of silence, "I knew his father once." "Ah, yes, I remember." But there was very little that he knew to remember. The son of an old friend, this was enough to account for a special interest. He had felt a peculiar interest himself in the bright young man, and there had always been a fear that he was in danger from the gay world. The stand taken this evening had given him a momentary feeling of joy, but the experiences of the past few days were so absorbing him that it had quickly passed from his mind. As they turned the corner which led to the Flats, Mr. Cleveland said, "She stayed all alone in the house last night. It ought not to have been. This is no place for an unprotected young girl like her. Miss Wainwright, I don't know how to thank you for this night's sacrificing kindness." "Why should you thank me?" asked this plain-spoken woman. "Why, is it anything to you?" To this no sort of answer was given, and the rest of the walk was taken in complete silence. It was after midnight again, and the town was still. Revelry there might be behind closely drawn shades or close folding shutters, but the respectable portion of the old town was, for the most part, in bed. Houses were dark. There was starlight and a late moon, therefore the street lamps were not lighted. One window was bright. The little cheery room, with its bright fire burning in the grate, its 2 rocking chairs drawn up to the table waiting, its big old Bible on the stand showed plainly to the passer-by. At the window there knelt again a woman. She had shaded the light in the early evening, when many were passing, and shaded herself from public gaze as well as she could, and, at the same time, not lose the sight of any face. But now the light burned up brightly, and she watched and waited. Suddenly she gave a quick spring forward into the night. "John," she said, her voice low and clear. "John," and she caught at the sleeve and held on. "Let me alone," said a muffled voice. "Let me go." She held on, and held with force, and drew him by sheer force backward a step. She had carefully kept up her strength all day for this moment. "John, oh, John, come in here. See, I am all alone. It is a nice place. No one will see you or hear. I have waited and waited for you." He tried to hold back even then, but she drew him by the power of her stronger will. He was fairly within the little bright room at last. She shut the door with a quick backward motion and turned the key and drew it from the lock. Then she drew down the shades. The outside world must not look in now. "John," she said, "sit down, poor John, and tell me all about it. They got hold of you, and you did not mean it. I know you did not. I trust you fully, John. You did not mean to go away from me ever again, but they got hold of you before you knew it, and then you were not willing to come home. I know all about it. You need not tell me. You are hungry. You must eat. I have supper waiting for you." She slipped into the outer room, the speck of a kitchen. The key was in her pocket. There was a bit of a cook stove there, and something hot and nourishing simmered on it. Miss Hunter herself was bending over it, rapidly dishing it up. She had a cup by her side, and she set down the bowl and poured coffee, hot and strong. "Give him this," she said. The wife's eyes were shining like coals. "Take this to him. I will get the other ready." Mrs. Hartzell seized the cup and went back to her husband. A night to remember? I should think so. As long as memory lasts to John Hartzell's wife, either on this side or the other, she knows that she will remember every word and look, and almost every thought of that night, as though it were photographed in pictures of flame before her. It was more than that. It was cut into her heart. She dealt with a soul on the very verge of human despair. You know nothing about the drunkard's despair. You cannot imagine it. Neither, they tell me, can I. I have heard one talk, and his picture was so vivid that it seems to me at times I can imagine the scene, yet what must it be to feel it? He drank the coffee, drank it with a feverish thirst, but he did it sullenly. He asked her why she was there. He told her that it was all over, that he had given up, that he had been in hell for the last 36 hours, and he knew that such was his portion. She must let him go. Why had she brought him there to torture him? His misery was deep enough now. He was going away where he would never trouble her or Kate any more. They would never hear of him again. To all of which she made answer only in a quiet, matter-of-fact way, "John, eat that, or drink this." Her excitement seemed to be gone. She was as still as the night, and as gentle in her tones and ways as a child. When she felt that he had taken all the nourishment she dared to give, she set aside the empty cup, and came and knelt down before him. "John, look here, I am not going to be deserted. I will not be. It is folly for you to talk in that way to me, for you cannot get away from me. We promised ourselves to each other forever, and there is no such thing as getting away from it. I will go with you to the world's end if you say so, but remember I am to be with you. John, you know the sort of life your father lived, but you must forget that and remember the way he died. Annie, he said to me that last night, remember this, God has saved me, and he can save anybody. That proves it. Do you never give up John for a minute. We must spend eternity together to make up for the way we have thrown away time. I promised him, John, and I mean to keep the promise. And now I want to tell you another thing. You can begin life over again and make up here. Father waited too long, but you are young. You can undo ever so much of the past. I know how to do it, and I can tell you the only way. You want God. You must have his power with you all the time. It is the only way to get through this dangerous world. I know I should have died last night or gone mad if I had not had God to hide me. He can hide you, and he will do it. Listen to this. In the fear of the Lord is strong confidence, and his children shall have a place of refuge. Think of that shall. How strong it is. God's shall. That is what you need. That is what you are looking for. I can show you how to find it. Think of walking these streets in strong confidence that no one can touch you because God has his strength wrapped all about you. John, you have tried it, and you know that human strength will not do. Here is God's strength waiting for you, and the way is so easy. Get down on your knees here with me and just say, God, for Christ's sake, take me, hide me in that place of refuge. He promised it, so he will never refuse you. Just a word and the thing is done. You don't know about it, what a strength there is and a power, but you will. He can't save you unless you want to be saved and are willing to let him do it. He had never heard such words before from his wife. In their earlier years she had been gentle and shrinking, and during the later bitter experiences of life she had been cowed and sullen. Now she was calm and resolute, and as sure, apparently, of the rock on which she rested as though it had been visible granite under her feet. It was no new story to this well-taught man. He had forgotten it long ago, but the memories of early years came trooping up to him, verse after verse of promise, pleading, warning, came and knocked at his heart. Never was there a fiercer battle waged with Satan for a soul than went on in that room that night, where the shades were drawn close for the first time. The hours passed, and the gray dawn of another morning began to creep over the world. In the little room they did not know it, for the shades were heavy and the lamp burned brightly still. At the back door in the kitchen there came a low tap. Miss Hunter went on tiptoe and set the door ajar. The knocker was Mr. Cleveland. "We saw him come in," he murmured, "and he certainly has not gone out again. I thought perhaps I ought to come and see if help were needed." Miss Hunter stepped out into the frosty air and closed the door behind her. Even with this precaution she bent forward and spoke in a whisper. "Mr. Cleveland, he prayed. I heard his voice, and I heard the first words. Then I stopped my ears, for I knew that they ought to be alone with God. I believe he is a saved man. I don't like to disturb them, but the fire must be getting low, and pretty soon they ought to have some breakfast." The prosaic and the eternities mingling! Yet while the flesh enfolds us, what are we to do without the prosaic? God bless the souls who, capable of rising to the heights which belong to immortality, yet think of fire and breakfast. Mr. Cleveland made one more call before he took his breakfast. Kate was up and dressed, and looking out of the south window, with the first streaks of morning sunlight glinting over her. She did not stop for his knock, but came to the door silent, waiting. He held out his hand to her, smiling. "Do you remember an old story which ran thus? 'Inquire in the house of Judas for one called Saul of Tarsus, for behold he prayeth?' History has repeated itself. If you inquire for one John Hartzell, behold he prayeth. That is the last word I have had of him, not 10 minutes ago. Kate, God has come down to us and stretched out his hand of power, and supplemented our weakness. Now you and I, with this token of what he is willing to do, must join hands and reach out to him in behalf of the perishing world. Can we work together, Kate?" And then Miss Wainwright came to the door. "I heard the first words," she said, "and went back to thank the Lord. Now you two may come in and have some breakfast. It is early, but somehow it seemed to me that a good breakfast would be needed here this morning, so I got up early and looked after it." And once more the eternities and the blessed prosaics met. End of Chapter 31. End of One Commonplace Day by Pansy. Recording by TriciaG.